I used to think there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Not the kind of wrong you can fix with a haircut or a new outfit, but the kind that runs deeper than bone, settling into the marrow of who you are until you forget what it feels like to belong anywhere. My family had a way of looking at me that made me feel like a mistake they couldn't quite figure out how to correct. At dinner tables, I was the silence between conversations. In family photos, I was the one whose smile never quite reached her eyes. My mother would introduce me to her friends with a sigh that said more than words ever could. "This is Sarah," she'd say, and somehow that simple sentence carried the weight of all her disappointments. I wasn't like my sister Emma, who collected academic awards like other kids collected stickers. I wasn't like my brother David, who could charm a room full of strangers before he'd even finished his first sentence. I was the one who asked too many questions, who spent too much time staring at screens, who got excited about things that made other people's eyes glaze over. "You're too intense," my father would say, not unkindly, but with the exhaustion of someone who'd given up trying to understand. Normal people don't think about these things, but I couldn't help thinking about these things. I couldn't help noticing how people moved through the world, how they connected, how they shared pieces of themselves through the glowing rectangles in their hands. I saw patterns where others saw chaos. I saw possibilities where others saw problems. I saw solutions hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to care enough to build them. In high school, I tried to fit in by shrinking myself down to acceptable sizes. I learned to nod along to conversations that bored me, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to pretend I cared about things that felt meaningless. I became an expert at making myself small, at taking up less space, at being less than what I was. The guidance counselor told me I was smart but unfocused, which felt like a polite way of saying I was broken. My teachers saw potential, but couldn't figure out where to direct it. My parents saw a daughter who was drifting, who couldn't seem to find her place in the world they understood. College was supposed to be different. College was supposed to be where people like me found their tribe, their purpose, their place. But I felt just as lost in lecture halls as I had in high school hallways. I switched majors 3 times, each change feeling like another admission of failure. Computer science was too technical, they said. Business was too cold. Liberal arts was too impractical. "You need to pick something and stick with it," my mother would say during our weekly phone calls, her voice carrying that familiar note of frustration. "You can't keep floating through life without direction." But I wasn't floating. I was drowning. I was drowning in the weight of expectations that didn't fit, in the pressure to become someone I wasn't, in the growing certainty that I would never be enough for the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The worst part wasn't the criticism. The worst part was the silence that followed it. The way conversations would pause when I entered a room, as if my presence had interrupted something important. The way my achievements were met with polite nods instead of genuine celebration. The way my struggles were dismissed as character flaws instead of recognized as growing pains. I started to believe them. I started to believe that I was the problem, that I was the broken piece in an otherwise perfect family puzzle. I started to believe that my dreams were too big, my ideas too strange, my ambitions too unrealistic for someone like me. That belief followed me into my 20s, like a shadow I couldn't shake. The call came on a Tuesday morning in September, the kind of crisp autumn day that should have felt full of possibilities. Instead, it felt like the final punctuation mark on a sentence I'd been trying to write my whole life. "Sarah, we need to talk." My father's voice on the phone carried a weight I'd never heard before, heavy with the kind of disappointment that settles into your bones and stays there. I was 26, living in a studio apartment in Portland, working at a startup that paid me just enough to survive on ramen and optimism. I'd been there for 2 years, watching other people's ideas come to life, contributing to projects that never quite captured the vision I saw so clearly in my mind. "Your mother and I have been talking," he continued, and I could hear her voice in the background, sharp and urgent. "We're concerned about you." Concerned. The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't escape. They were concerned. About my career, my lifestyle, my inability to find a real job with benefits and a pension plan. They were concerned about my apartment, my car, my bank account. They were concerned about my future, about the choices I was making, about the person I was becoming. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my laptop screen, counting down the seconds until I could hang up and pretend this wasn't happening. They talked about responsibility and practicality and the importance of thinking about tomorrow instead of chasing dreams that might never come true. "We love you," my mother said near the end. And somehow those 3 words felt like the cruelest thing she could have said. But we can't keep pretending that what you're doing is working. They weren't cutting me off, not exactly. But they were withdrawing their support, their encouragement, their belief in me. They were tired of watching me struggle, tired of waiting for me to figure it out, tired of hoping I would eventually become someone they could be proud of. After I hung up, I sat in my tiny apartment and cried until I had no tears left. I cried for the little girl who used to build impossible things with Lego blocks. I cried for the teenager who spent hours coding in her bedroom, creating worlds that existed only in her imagination. I cried for the young woman who believed she could change the world if she just worked hard enough, dreamed big enough, cared deeply enough. That night, I walked to the bridge that overlooked the city, the one where people go when they need to think or pray or figure out what comes next. The lights below looked like stars that had fallen to earth, each one representing someone's home, someone's dreams, someone's life. I thought about calling Emma, but I knew she'd tell me to be practical. I thought about calling David, but I knew he'd try to fix me with advice I wasn't ready to hear. I thought about calling my parents back, about apologizing for being such a disappointment, about promising to be different. Instead, I stood there in the cold October air and made a different kind of promise. I promised myself that I would stop trying to be the person they wanted me to be. I promised myself that I would stop apologizing for dreaming too big, for caring too much, for seeing possibilities where others saw problems. I promised myself that I would build something beautiful, something meaningful, something that mattered, not to prove them wrong, but to prove myself right. Not to win their approval, but to earn my own. That promise tasted like freedom and terror in equal measure. It tasted like the beginning of something I couldn't yet name, something that would either save me or destroy me completely. I walked home in the darkness, my footsteps echoing off empty sidewalks, carrying that promise like a seed I was finally ready to plant. The idea came to me 3 weeks later, not in a flash of inspiration, but in a slow burn of recognition. I was sitting in a coffee shop downtown, watching people move through their morning routines, when I noticed something I'd seen 1,000 times before, but never really understood. Everyone was connected, but no one was really connecting. Everyone was sharing, but no one was really being seen. Everyone was speaking, but no one was really being heard. I watched a woman at the corner table post a photo of her latte, watched her check for likes and comments, watched her face fall slightly when the response wasn't what she'd hoped for. I watched a man by the window scroll through his feed, his thumb moving in mechanical swipes, his eyes glazed with the particular kind of emptiness that comes from consuming content that doesn't nourish. I thought about my own social media accounts, the carefully curated versions of myself I presented to the world. I thought about the gap between who I was online and who I was in real life, the exhausting performance of being someone worth following. That's when it hit me. Not the solution, but the problem. The real problem. The one hiding underneath all. The surface-level complaints about social media and digital connection. People weren't just lonely. They were lost. They were lost in the noise, lost in the performance, lost in the endless scroll of other people's highlight reels. They were hungry for something real, something authentic, something that made them feel seen and understood and valued for who they actually were. I started sketching in the margins of my notebook, drawing circles and lines and arrows that represented the connections I wanted to create, not the shallow connections of likes and follows, but the deep connections of shared experience and genuine understanding. The app I began to envision wasn't about broadcasting your life to the world. It was about finding your people, your tribe, your chosen family. It was about creating spaces where vulnerability was rewarded instead of punished, where questions were welcomed instead of dismissed, where being different was celebrated instead of corrected. I called it Kindred. The name came to me while I was walking home from the coffee shop, carrying my notebook full of sketches and ideas and possibilities. Kindred spirits, kindred souls, people who understood each other not because they were the same, but because they were different in compatible ways. That night, I cleared off my kitchen table and spread out everything I'd been thinking about. I made lists and diagrams and flowcharts. I researched existing apps and platforms, looking for the gaps I could fill, the needs I could meet, the problems I could solve. I worked until sunrise, fueled by coffee and the kind of electric energy that comes from finally finding your purpose. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of communities forming, of strangers becoming friends, of people finding their place in the world. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Then I did it again the next day. And the next. I wasn't sick, but I wasn't lying either. I was sick of building other people's dreams. I was sick of settling for good enough. I was sick of being the black sheep in a family that couldn't see my worth. I started building Kindred with $2,000 from my savings account and a determination that surprised even me. I taught myself new programming languages, watched countless YouTube tutorials, joined online communities where other people were building impossible things with nothing but vision and stubbornness. My apartment became a laboratory. My kitchen table became a command center. My life became a study and obsession. The good kind that makes you forget to eat and sleep and worry about what other people think. I quit my job on a Friday in November, walking out of the office with a box of personal belongings that fit in my backpack. My coworkers thought I was crazy, and maybe I was, but it was the kind of crazy that felt like sanity, the kind of crazy that felt like coming home to myself. The months that followed were the hardest and most beautiful of my life. I lived on savings and stubbornness, eating cereal for dinner, and wearing the same clothes for days at a time. I coded until my eyes burned and my fingers cramped. I tested and refined and rebuilt and tested again. I didn't tell my family what I was doing. I couldn't bear the thought of their concerned voices, their practical questions, their well-meaning advice to get a real job and stop chasing dreams that might not come true. Instead, I built in secret, in silence, in the space between who I used to be and who I was becoming. I built for the girl who never fit in, for the woman who was tired of pretending to be smaller than she was, for the dreamer who refused to let other people's limitations become her own. Some nights, I would sit in my empty apartment and wonder if I was making a terrible mistake. Some nights, I would stare at my bank account and feel the familiar panic of not having enough, not being enough, not doing enough. But every morning, I would open my laptop and see the lines of code that were slowly becoming something real, something that mattered, something that could change the world in small but meaningful ways. And every morning, I would keep building. The first users found Kindred in March, 6 months after I'd started building it. I'd launched quietly, sharing it in a few online communities where I thought people might understand what I was trying to create. I'll never forget the first review that appeared in the App Store. It was written by a woman named Maria, and it said simply, "Finally, a place where I can be myself." 5 words that made every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every sacrifice worth it. More reviews followed,